Have you ever told a story and found you kind of avoid dialogue, you avoid conversations? You ever done that? Because conversations are complex, they're difficult, you don't know how to do them. You ever had that reaction? I've had it. I thought conversations are difficult. I don't know what conversations to do, what conversations work, and I just didn't know how to do them. And I thought, I'm just going to ignore. I'm just going to ignore the conversations entirely, not deal with them, not face up to them, not work with them. And then, one day I read this book by Craig Valentine called World Class Speaking. Great book. And Craig Valentine became kind of a virtual mentor. And I talked to my friend Bob, who's a brown-haired, glasses, really interested in public speaking. I said, Bob, I just discovered a really great thing about public speaking, and that is that there are 3 types of conversations. 3 types of conversations go on. Bob said, Tim, why do you have to have 3 types of conversations? I said, Bob, if you have 3 types of conversations, then that's 3 times the power your story has. With 3 times the conversations, your story has 3 times the power getting across to your audience. It connects 3 different ways. You can triple your effectiveness as a storyteller just by using these different conversations. And I explained to Bob how it worked, how these 3 different types of conversations work, why they were so important, how they worked, and how they all fit together. And he started using them and discovered it was pretty simple. I started using them, discovered it was pretty simple, and it tripled the effectiveness of the story. Because now I connect with the audience 3 different ways. How would you like to connect with your audience 3 different ways? How would you like to dialogue deeply and interconnectedly with the audience and really make that connection? Well, if you'd like to do that, great, because that's what's going to happen. Now the thing is, if you decide you don't want to do that, you don't want to go to all that bother of, why do I want to connect 3 different ways? Let's have a typical conversation story, that'll be fine. You miss out on making that deep connection with your audience. You may connect kind of on a surface level, a little bit upper level, but the deep connection you won't have, and if you aren't careful, it'll sound like you're kind of pushing your audience and telling them what to do. And then your audience will push back, and you won't have any connection at all. But if you start to understand these 3 different dialogues, these 3 different conversations, you can connect in deeper, stronger, faster than you've ever thought before with your stories. Because instead of trying to get your audience to tell them what to do, you start asking them. As you start asking them, you pull them in. And these conversations help you make an effective ask to your audience. So today you'll discover these 3 different types of conversations. You'll discover how these 3 different types of conversations work, how you use them to build and pull in the audience and get them involved. You will learn the effectiveness of these 3 conversations. And along the way, find out more about how stories work and how you get the audience involved and keep them involved in your story all the way throughout. In the next 20 minutes or so, you will discover deep storytelling tools that you can take with you long after this video is over. Deep storytelling tools you can use anytime you're out there and you really want to tell a story, you really want to connect with your audience. You have a simple, easy, effective tool you can use to make that connection. And I'm going to start out by talking about the most obvious types of dialogue, types of conversation people are probably most familiar with. Then I'll go on to talk about the less familiar types of dialogue, and then finally finish up with a type of dialogue you may not think about at all. But if you don't use it, you're losing that opportunity to really connect in deeply with your audience. And now, Come with me and we'll learn together and explore the power of dialogue and learning the 3 types of dialogue. And the first type of dialogue is something you probably are already doing in your stories anyway. It's the normal type of dialogue. When you think of dialogue, you probably are thinking about this. And just a word about the word dialogue. Dialogue means conversations. Conversations back and forth. Now, there's a very obvious, very simple one that you use in stories. However, if you aren't using this dialogue in stories, then your stories simply sit there. In fact, you could even argue they aren't a story because a certain element of the story is missing. If you do use this, you connect in deeper and stronger, and you get that initial connection with the audience. It pulls the audience in because dialogue of this type is very well known, very well understood, very natural to the audience. So they naturally listen in and want to hear more. And this first type of dialogue is simply conversations between 2 story characters. In the beginning, in the opening of this talk, there were 2 characters. And one was me, and the other was Bob. And Bob and I talked back and forth. I said something, Bob said something, and it really helped to develop and build that sense of the story and pulling in by having the dialogue and the conversations going on. Maybe you've heard a story where you don't get that type of dialogue, you don't get that type of conversation. And the thing you notice very quickly is it becomes a narrative. And probably the person uses the word that. And I said that I was really upset, and they said that they were upset too, and we were both kind of upset, and then they said that they were going to do something else. If you find yourself using the word that a lot in your stories, most likely you're narrating and you're not telling the story. It's a very easy habit to fall into. Because it seems like it's easier just to say, oh, they said that they were upset, they said that they were going on, because the dialogue seems like a lot of work. Maybe you've had that reaction. You think, getting the dialogue going? That's just a lot of big deal. And maybe you're thinking, Tim, I just want to do the dialogue thing. I don't want to do that. It's too much work. It's too much bother. Okay. I understand. But the thing about a dialogue, a natural back and forth dialogue, is that it is natural, it is simple. And it's easy to create because that's the way people talk. Don't walk up to somebody and say, I said that I'm angry with you. And they don't respond, and I said that I'm angry with you too. No! People talk in dialogue. You come up to someone and you say, I'm angry with you. And then they say back to you, I'm angry with you too. Dialogue. Back and forth. Conversation. That's what it's all about. If you just use that one simple tool in your stories, you'll make your stories more effective. Now to triple them, there are 2 other tools that you really need to develop and really need to start using if you're going to get the effectiveness and connection with the audience, that a deep connection and affection with the audience that hopefully, perhaps, you want to get. But even if all you do is that first level of conversation, say, hi, how are you? And the other person says, I'm fine, how are things going? Well, I'm having a bad day. Well, why is that? Even if you get just that level of conversation going on, you never go any deeper, that's still much better than, I said that it was a good day. They responded that it was nice too. The thing about that is it distances the audience from the story. It distances from the whole thing. You're narrating things. They have to get to the story through you. When you have a dialogue, it's in real life. It's happening right then. Right then, things are happening back and forth. The audience can see that back and forth. They get excited about it and interested in it. This first level can help a lot. When you go to the second level of dialogue, you create even a deeper connection. This second level of dialogue is something you probably don't think a lot about, but can be very, very effective with your audience. So one way you can handle conversations is conversations between characters. You're probably aware of that. Probably aware that if you've got a story going on, you're going to have a conversation between characters. There's a second way you can have a conversation going on, and it might not be a way you're thinking about. It might be a way that you just never really thought about before, because you can argue, oh, that's not really a conversation. Say, Tim, that's not a conversation. It's only one-sided, so it can't be a conversation. You've got a point, but there is a sense of a kind of a back and forth. If you don't use this, then you'll have your conversation back and forth in the story, but you really won't have an in-depth conversation going on because the audience won't quite know how you feel about it. If you use this simple conversational method, then the audience gets a sense of what you're feeling. And I was feeling the same sort of way as you're probably feeling about it right now. I was thinking, how could this work? Multiple conversations, this is craziness. When I'm telling a story, there was a conversation between two people and that's it. There's not this other conversation going back and forth. It doesn't make any sense. And I thought, maybe I'll try it, see how it works. Just try it out, see how the thing works. When I tried it out, I discovered it worked very well. Pulls the audience in, gets them involved at a deeper level than just conversation back and forth between the characters in the story can do. And that second level of conversation is conversation you have with yourself. Like right now. Just before I was having a little bit of conversation with myself, I was sharing my own thoughts with you. If you share your own thoughts with you, the things going on in your head with your audience, gives it a chance the audience to get some more insight about what's going on. Get a little bit deeper sense of what's happening, why it's happening, what's going on, what you're thinking about it. It also gives the audience a chance to think, I'm thinking the same thing. And when you talk about what you're thinking, and it turns out the audience is thinking the same thing, that can form a very deep connection. So, another type of conversation is a conversation where you have an inner conversation. So far we've covered two types of conversation, between characters, and then the inner conversation you have with yourself, and that you share with your audience. And in doing that, you give the audience a chance to connect in deeper and stronger than they ever could. It's a simple technique, a simple method. You can use that to connect in deeply. So far, your story character has really developed. Not only do your story characters talk to each other, there's also this inner dialogue going on. And if you left there, that'd be pretty good. You could just leave the whole thing right there and that'd be it. But there is a third level. There is a third level of conversation that's similar to these other things, but it is a stronger level and it will pull your audience in even deeper. Because talking to yourself is great, but there's something else you can do that'll really involve the audience, really get them interested, really get them going. We're almost there. Now we're about to put it all together. So we reach that third level. That third level of communicating and getting the story really to connect deeply with our audience. And now you've arrived. Finally, everything's going to come together. You're going to have 3 times the ability to connect in with your audience you've ever had before. You're going to have more richer characters, more interest, more interconnection. The audience will connect deeper, stronger than you ever thought possible. It's this third way that if you don't use it, you'll connect in pretty well. I mean, just in connecting between characters and the interconnection we talked about earlier, the conversation between characters and the inner conversation, that's great stuff. But there's one more thing. One more thing that can really help you connect deeply, and if you don't use it, you just don't take that next step. You don't take that final leap. If you do use it, a very simple, easy technique, then everything comes together. You can use all 3 for tremendous power. Right now you're probably thinking, okay, Tim, just stop wasting your time. I mean, all this teasing and stuff. What is this third connection? What is this third connection that's so powerful? What is this third conversational technique that's so important you build all the way up to it? What's the big deal? I'll tell you what it is. I'll tell you what that third thing is. The third thing that really will help you connect in with your audience, the third type of conversation is audience conversation. And you just heard one now. Audience conversation. You talk to the audience, telling them what they're already thinking. You have a conversation with what the audience is saying, what the audience is thinking, what's going on through the audience's mind. And if you can do that well, then you really connect in. Because the audience knows you get them. And more importantly, you really focused on the audience and what they're thinking. Because it's all about the audience. It's all about you. So easy in these connections to get caught up in, I'm going to tell my story, and that's all I care about is the conversations going on between characters. Maybe at another level, that inner conversation. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about what I'm thinking inside. But the audience really wants to hear what you really want to hear. It's about you. Isn't it wonderful when the speaker gets up there and they talk to you, for you, and you know it's all about you? That great feeling? You think, the speaker really gets me. The speaker really understands what I'm interested in. That's so exciting, so interesting, powerful. So you can have this audience conversation, you can pull everything in, and then you just put the whole thing together. You put the whole thing together. Like the other day, I was talking with Bob. I said, Bob, I just learned about these 3 levels of conversation. He said, yeah, Tim, you told me about it. I'm using it already, Tim. It's really good stuff. I said, Bob, you bet it is. Works every single time. And I thought, how great that Bob's using this. So wonderful. He's going to be such a better speaker. Now, you may be wondering, well, it worked for Bob, but is it going to work for me? Yeah, sure, maybe Bob has no problem with it, but for me it should be a problem. Don't worry. It's not a problem. It's simple. You just have to combine 3 types of speaking, that's all. Speaking between characters in your story. Inner speaking. And then audience speaking. Telling the audience what's going on. And that will triple your speaking power and triple your effectiveness. It's that third thing, getting the audience conversation right, that just puts you over the top. Few speakers do it. But if you're the speaker who does it, you're special, you shine, and the audience thinks, wow, you get me. You really get me. So to wrap things up, today you learned about 3 different types of dialogue. How these 3 types of dialogue can help you connect and interconnect with your audience. First type of dialogue is probably the type you're most familiar with. Dialogue between characters. Between characters in your story. And that dialogue goes something like this. If you had a character Bob, you're talking to Bob, you might say, Bob, since you've been using that inter-character dialogue, you've been really doing well with your stories. Bob said, yeah, Tim, I've noticed that inter-character dialogue really works well. Connecting between characters really helps my story get across. And I said, yeah, Bob, it really does work. That's a dialogue between characters. You and Bob are talking to each other, and there's kind of a back and forth going on. When people think of dialogue, they tend to think of something like that. It's very important when you're giving your stories, you're telling your stories, you have some sort of dialogue back and forth like that. Instead of examples, tell a story and make sure that story has some sort of back and forth dialogue between characters. There's another type of dialogue too. It doesn't involve another person, it just involves you. And that's inner dialogue, where you're talking to yourself. And that goes something like this. And I thought, I think I'm going to need to try this dialogue thing and see how it works. I think it's about time I started working on dialogue, because I understand it's so important. That's how that works. It's an inner dialogue where you're talking to yourself. And notice there's no back and forth, but you're kind of struggling with things, thinking things out, and that's why, in some sense, it's a dialogue. Thinking things out in your mind. And that creates this kind of conversation, this kind of dialogue going on. There's one other type of dialogue, which can even be more powerful than that inner dialogue, and that is audience dialogue. If you can get to understand what the audiences are thinking and suggest that that's something they're thinking, that can be very powerful. Audience dialogue goes something like, you might be thinking, this whole dialogue thing seems like a lot of work, Tim. Seems like a big bother. Why should I bother learning all this dialogue? What's really the effectiveness of it? That's audience dialogue, where you create inner thoughts of your audience and what they're thinking, what's going on through their heads. And as mentioned, if you can get inside their heads and really say what they're thinking, it'll be very powerful, very effective. So basically, you take their own arguments out from underneath them. You say the things that they're thinking, and then you answer those things, and you get that deep connection. If you don't use these three types of dialogue, or only use one or two of them, your stories will be okay. They'll be all right, but they won't connect as deeply as they could. The audience will have certain reservations in themselves if you don't use audience dialogue. The audience won't understand what you're thinking if you don't use inner dialogue. And if you tell a story which doesn't have dialogue between characters, it's a boring story. On the other hand, if you use these three types of dialogue, you get not only the between-character dialogue, but a richer understanding where the audience gets to actually explore inside your mind. Powerful as that is, even more powerful is when you get inside the audience's mind. So you have dialogue between characters, dialogue inside your mind, dialogue inside your audience's mind. You're 3 times as powerful with your dialogue and getting your story across the audience as you were before. It's simple, and if you use these simple techniques, the audience will see you as a leader, somebody who knows what the heck they're talking about. It's a simple process you now can apply every time you're out there and you have dialogue. And it doesn't take that long. You just, boom, it gets done. One and done. Use these 3 types of dialogue, make the connection. And you start to enjoy being out there and being on stage. If you want to connect with the audience and make that deep, lasting connection, use 3 types of dialogue and be 3 times the speaker you were before.